I mean, the trio, usually two of us take like background parts and then he'll do the bass line most of the time and then he says our beatboxer.
They stood before the world as something almost impossible to believe. 5 voices, no instruments, no safety net. Just breath, harmony, and an almost supernatural chemistry that made audiences forget music had ever needed anything else. Pentatonix didn't just perform songs. They transformed them, stripped them down to their bones, rebuilt them into something transcendent, and delivered them with a precision that left critics scrambling for new vocabulary. Grammy Awards followed. Billions of YouTube views followed. Sold-out arenas followed. Everything the music industry promised its brightest stars seemed to pour down on them at once. But behind that luminous sound, something else was building. Something quieter, darker, and far more human than any headline ever captured. The story of Pentatonix is not simply a story of 5 talented people who made it big. It is the story of what making it big actually costs. The sleepless nights that don't get documented. The mental health battles that don't get set to music. The moment one member looked at everything they had built together and realized, with devastating clarity, that staying would break him. The tragedy of Pentatonix is not one single catastrophic moment. It is a slow, accumulating weight that bent each of them in different directions, even as their voices continued to rise together in perfect unison. To understand how it all unraveled, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a high school hallway in Arlington, Texas, where 3 teenagers found in each other something they hadn't been able to find anywhere else. Scott Hoying, Kirsten Maldonado, and Mitch Grassi were not the kind of students who fit neatly into the social architecture of high school. Scott was expressive and restless, someone who experienced music as something closer to emotional necessity than hobby. Kirsten carried a voice that seemed to belong to someone older and wiser, warm and luminous in equal measure. Mitch was, even then, a singular presence, his vocal range and theatrical instincts placing him in a category that his peers simply could not reach. Together, these 3 found what every outsider eventually discovers when they find their people, that the world becomes considerably more bearable when someone else truly understands you. Their harmonies in empty classrooms and school corridors weren't rehearsals for a career. They were acts of survival. The first real spark came from a local radio contest, a chance to meet the cast of the television show Glee. They recorded a cover of Lady Gaga's Telephone, submitted it, and lost. But something had shifted. People had listened. The sound they made together had registered in a way that none of them had quite anticipated. Years later, when Scott headed to the University of Southern California to study music, he joined the SoCal Vocals, a competitive a cappella group that sharpened his instincts and broadened his ambitions. But the pull of that original trio never loosened. When NBC announced auditions for the 3rd season of the Sing-Off, Scott felt something that he later described as undeniable intuition. He called Mitch. He called Kirsten. And they said yes. The problem was simple: the Sing-Off required groups of 5. They had 3. What happened next felt, in retrospect, like the kind of alignment that only makes sense when you look backward. Abby Kaplan entered their lives first, a bass vocalist with a voice so deep and resonant it seemed to come from somewhere geological, from the bedrock of the earth itself. He was trained, experienced, and deeply respected in Acapella circles. His tone didn't fill space so much as it defined it, giving the group a foundation that felt permanent and inevitable. Then came Kevin Olusala, a Yale-educated cellist who had gone viral for something the internet genuinely hadn't seen before: cello boxing, the simultaneous performance of classical cello and beatboxing, an act of musical duality that expanded every definition of what the ensemble could do. The 5 of them met exactly 1 day before their audition. 1 single day. And yet when they took the stage, something locked into place with such ease that it suggested the kind of chemistry that cannot be manufactured, only discovered. They won Season 3 of the Sing-Off in 2011, and for a brief, gleaming moment, it seemed the path ahead would be smooth. It was not. Epic Records signed them and then dropped them within months, concluding, as the industry so often does, that it could not figure out how to market what it did not fully understand. What Pentatonix did next became one of the defining stories of the digital music era. They turned to YouTube. From a small Los Angeles apartment, armed with nothing but arrangements of extraordinary precision and an almost instinctive understanding of what online audiences wanted, they began building an audience that no label had handed them. Their cover of Gaudier's "Somebody That I Used to Know" exploded across the internet. Evolution of music, a rapid-fire sprint through centuries of musical history, became a phenomenon. Subscribers multiplied. Views climbed into the hundreds of millions. The music industry, which had decided it had no use for them, watched as Pentatonix proved it had no need for the music industry. But here is the part that view counts don't tell you. When you grow that fast, when your audience multiplies almost overnight and your inbox fills with expectations and your calendar begins to look like something built for a machine rather than a human being, the pressure that accumulates is unlike anything gradual success prepares you for. Every upload had to outperform the last. Every arrangement had to be tighter than the one before. Every performance had to be flawless, because the standard Pentatonix had set for themselves had become, in the minds of their millions of fans, the baseline. Perfection was no longer an achievement. It was simply what was expected. Each member of Pentatonix carried that pressure differently, and each carried additional weight that was entirely their own. Scott, positioned naturally as the group's public-facing anchor, felt the crushing responsibility of leadership. Creative direction, public image, group cohesion, brand decisions, these things settled on his shoulders with a heaviness that his perpetual smile did an expert job of concealing. Kirsten bore a burden that was both professional and deeply personal. As the only woman in the group, she existed under a microscope that operated differently than the ones aimed at her bandmates. Scrutiny followed her in ways that had nothing to do with her voice and everything to do with who she was in relation to the men around her. Mitch, brilliant and luminous on stage, wrestled privately with questions of identity, self-worth, and the complicated emotional experience of living in a spotlight that felt more exposing than warm. Kevin Olusala, steady and disciplined in ways that belied his extraordinary talent, worked quietly to balance profound personal faith, surging ambition, and the very real sacrifices that come with a touring schedule that leaves no room for stillness. But it was Abby Kaplan whose internal experience was perhaps the furthest from what audiences believed they were seeing. From the outside, Abby looked unshakable. Grounded, calm, the kind of quiet presence that made a room feel settled just by being in it. His voice was the group's foundation, and his personality seemed to match that function perfectly. But the life that Pentatonix required of its members, the endless touring, the relentless content creation, the perpetual motion of global fame, was slowly, methodically incompatible with who Avi actually was. He craved simplicity. He needed nature, quiet, stillness, the kind of life that cannot be scheduled between sound checks and press junkets. Music, for Avi, had always been something spiritual rather than spectacular. But Pentatonix, by the mid-2010s, had become something enormous, a machine of extraordinary beauty, but a machine nonetheless. In 2017, Abby Kaplan announced that he was leaving Pentatonix. The farewell video he recorded was not dramatic in the way that celebrity departures so often are. There was no feuding, no betrayal narrative, no scandalous revelation. There was only a man in visible emotional pain, speaking with rare honesty about what the life of global stardom had done to him. He spoke about being unable to see his family. He spoke about the music that no longer felt true to him in this context. He spoke with the kind of vulnerable clarity that most public figures spend entire careers carefully avoiding. And then he left. The grief that swept through the Pentatonix fanbase was immediate and overwhelming. Avi had not merely been a member of the group. For many fans, he had been its soul, the deep, warm, grounding frequency beneath everything they loved about the sound. Social media became a space of collective mourning. And within the group itself, something irreplaceable had changed. The remaining 4 members faced a question that had no comfortable answer. What were they now? They brought in Matt Sallee, a baritone with a rich bass range, genuine warmth, and a humility that suited the group's character. But Matt walked into an extraordinarily difficult situation. He was not replacing a performer so much as stepping into a grief that was still very much active, trying to earn the trust of a fanbase that was not yet ready to stop mourning the person he had been asked to follow. He did so with remarkable grace. Over time, and it did take time, Matt stopped being the new member and became something more integrated, a genuine part of the Pentatonix sound. But the road to that belonging was its own kind of quiet emotional ordeal. The pandemic of 2020 brought the entire enterprise to a halt, and in that enforced stillness, each member of Pentatonix confronted things that the relentless pace of their career had allowed them to defer indefinitely. Scott, suddenly without the structure of constant performance, faced anxieties about identity and mental health that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface. He spoke later, with uncommon honesty, about the emotional depletion that years of carrying the group had produced. His marriage in 2023 brought genuine joy and grounding, but he acknowledged that the weight of leadership had left marks that happiness alone could not erase. Mitch used the pandemic's silence to explore himself in ways the Pentatonix framework had never quite permitted. His solo project, Mesa, was darker, more intimate, and more artistically daring than anything he had done within the group. The transformation was deliberate and deeply personal. He had spent years as one of the most mesmerizing performers in popular music, and yet something in that performance had always felt constrained. The solo work was a form of liberation, and the emotional honesty it required was also a form of exposure that cost him something real. Kirsten used the pause to reclaim parts of herself that years of emotional labor within the group had quietly eroded. She had often functioned as an informal emotional center for Pentatonix, the person who maintained unity when tensions rose, who absorbed difficulties so that the group could keep moving. The pandemic gave her space to redirect some of that energy inward, back toward her own artistry and her own story. She began speaking more publicly about the unique pressures she had navigated as a woman in a male-dominated lineup, and her solo work became an expression of an identity that was finally allowed to be fully her own. Kevin's transformation was perhaps the most quietly profound. Fatherhood arrived and reoriented everything. The priorities that had organized his life for the better part of a decade suddenly had to be renegotiated. He found that his faith, always a source of strength, deepened in ways that the constant motion of the pre-pandemic years had not allowed. His solo album became a document of that inner shift, an honest account of what it means to evolve as a person when the world you have built your identity around suddenly goes still. What Pentatonix represents today is more complex and more human than any collection of Grammy Awards or viral view counts could capture. Their trajectory has been shaped not by uninterrupted triumph but by fracture and repair, by the specific kind of strength that only emerges when things have actually broken and been put back together. They have lost a founding member to the weight of a life he could not sustain. They have each walked through their own private darkness, some of which the public has glimpsed and some of which remains their own. They have survived a global shutdown that gave them nowhere to hide from themselves. And yet they continue. Their holiday specials remain among the most watched musical events of the season. Their live shows still fill venues. Their arrangements still stop people in the middle of whatever they are doing and demand to be heard. The human voice, unaccompanied and utterly exposed, still does through Pentatonix what it has always done. It reaches past every defense a listener has constructed and touches something fundamental. The tragedy of Pentatonix is real. It lives in Avi's farewell video, in Scott's quiet admissions about depletion, in Kirsten's years of invisible labor, in Mitch's search for an identity that fame kept partially obscured, in Kevin's negotiation between ambition and peace, in Matt's entrance into a grief he had to walk through rather than around. But the tragedy has never been the whole story. The whole story includes what came after the breaking, what each of them chose to do with the damage, and how 5 voices, changed almost beyond recognition by everything they had been through, kept finding their way back to each other. That, more than any Grammy, more than any billion-view milestone, is the legacy that matters. The music was extraordinary. The humanity behind it was more extraordinary still.